Chapter 6 on Socialism and Desocialization. 1. Wealth can be brought into existence or increased in three and only three ways: by perceiving certain nature-given things as scarce and actively bringing them into one's possession before anyone else has done so, homesteading; by producing goods with the help of one's labor and such previously appropriated resources; or by acquiring a good through voluntary contractual transfer from a previous appropriator or producer. Acts of original appropriation turn something which no one had previously perceived as scarce into an income-providing asset. Acts of production are by their very nature aimed at the transformation of a less valuable asset into a more valuable one, and every contractual exchange concerns the exchange and redirection of specific assets from the hands of those who value their possessions less to those who value them more. It should be noted that each of these activities fulfills the requirements of a so-called Pareto superior move, that is, of enhancing the welfare of at least one individual without diminishing that of another. Hence, even in the absence of the possibility of interpersonal comparison of utility, every one of these activities can be said to increase social welfare. On Vilfredo Pareto's strictures regarding the meaningful use of the term social welfare, see his Manual of Political Economy, where he writes, quote, "Consider any position and assume that we move away from it by a very small amount consistent with the restrictions of achieving the greatest possible welfare of the individuals of a collectivity. If in doing so the welfare of all individuals of the collectivity is increased, it is obvious that the new position is more advantageous to each one of them, and vice versa. It is less so if the welfare of all the individuals is decreased. Moreover, the welfare of some of them can remain the same without changing these conclusions. But on the other hand, if this small movement increases the welfare of certain individuals and decreases that of others, we can no longer state positively that it is advantageous to the entire collectivity to carry out this movement." End quote. Now, if a man uses his body, labor, in order to appropriate, that is, bring under his control, some other nature-given things, unowned land, this action demonstrates that he values these things. Hence, he must have gained utility in appropriating them. At the same time, his action does not make anyone else worse off, for in appropriating previously unowned resources, nothing is taken away from others. Others could have appropriated these resources too if they had considered them valuable, yet they demonstrably did not do so. Indeed, their failure to appropriate them demonstrates their preference for not appropriating them. Thus they cannot possibly be said to have lost any utility as a result of another's appropriation. Proceeding from the basis of acts of original appropriation, any further act, whether of production or consumption, is equally Pareto superior on demonstrated preference grounds, provided that it does not affect the physical integrity of the resources appropriated or produced with appropriated means by others. The producer-consumer is better off while everyone else is left in control of the same quantity of goods as before. As a result, no one can be said to be worse off. Finally, every voluntary exchange of goods proceeding from this basis is a Pareto superior change as well, because it can only take place if both exchange parties expect to benefit from it, while the supply of goods controlled in action, owned by others, remains unchanged. From this it follows that socialism can only lead to impoverishment. First of all, under socialism, ownership of productive assets is assigned to a collective of individuals regardless of each member's prior action or inaction relative to the owned assets. In effect, socialist ownership favors the non-homesteader, the non-producer, and the non-contractor, and disadvantages homesteaders, producers, and contractors. Accordingly, there will be less original appropriation of natural resources whose scarcity is realized, there will be less production of new and less upkeep of old factors of production, and there will be less contracting, for all of these activities involve costs. Under a regime of collective ownership, the cost of performing them is raised, and that of not performing them is lowered. Second, since means of production cannot be sold under socialism, no market prices for factors of production exist. Without such prices, cost accounting is impossible. Inputs cannot be compared with outputs, and it is impossible to decide if their usage for a given purpose is worthwhile or leads to the squandering of scarce resources in the pursuit of projects with relatively little or no importance for consumers. Because he is not permitted to take offers from private individuals who might see an alternative way of using a given means of production, the socialist caretaker of capital goods does not know what his foregone opportunities are. Hence, permanent misallocations of production factors must ensue. Third, even given some initial allocation, Since input factors and the output produced are owned collectively, every single producer's incentive to increase the quantity and or quality of his individual output is systematically diminished, and his incentive to use input factors so as to avoid their over- or underutilization is reduced. Instead, with gains and losses in the socialist firm's capital and sales account socialized instead of attributed to specific individual producers, everyone's inclination toward laziness and negligence is systematically encouraged. Hence, an inferior quality and or quantity of goods will be produced, and permanent capital consumption will ensue. Fourth, under a regime of private property, the person who owns a resource can determine independently of others what to do with it. If he wants to increase his wealth and or rise in social status, he can only do so by better serving the most urgent wants of voluntary consumers through the use he makes of his property. With collectively owned factors of production, collective decision-making mechanisms are required. Every decision as to what, how, and for whom to produce, how much to pay or charge, and whom to promote or demote is a political affair. Any disagreement must be settled by superimposing one person's will on another's view, and this invariably creates winners and losers. Hence, if one wants to climb the ladder under socialism, one must resort to one's political talents. It is not the ability to initiate, to work, and to respond to the needs of consumers that assure success. Rather, it is by means of persuasion, demagoguery, and intrigue through promises, bribes, and threats that one rises to the top. Needless to say, this politicalization of society implied by any system of collective ownership contributes even more to impoverishment. It should be emphasized here in particular that, contrary to widespread belief, the lack of democracy has essentially nothing to do with socialism's inefficiency. It is not the rules according to which politicians are selected for their office that constitutes the problem. It is politics and political decision-making as such. Instead of each producer deciding independently what to do with particular resources, as under a regime of private property and contractualism, with socialized factors of production, each decision requires a collective's permission. It is irrelevant to the producer how those given permission are chosen. What matters to him is that permission must be sought at all. As long as this is the case, the incentive for producers to produce is reduced, and impoverishment will continue. Private property is as incompatible with democracy, then, as with any other form of political rule. Rather, with the institution of private property, an anarchy of production is established, in which no one rules anyone, and all producers' relations are voluntary and thus mutually beneficial. 2. The manifest bankruptcy of socialism all across Eastern Europe since the late 1980s, after some 70 years of social experimentation, provides a sad illustration of the validity of economic theory. What does the theory that long ago predicted this result as inevitable now imply regarding how Eastern Europe can rise most quickly from the ruins of socialism? Since the ultimate cause of its economic misery is the collective ownership of factors of production, the solution and key to a prosperous future is privatization. Yet how should socialized property be privatized? While a vast body of literature dealing with the socialization of private property exists, little has been written on how to desocialize. The reason for this neglect, one would suspect, is to be found in most Western intellectuals' persistent, explicit or implicit socialist predilections. Given these, any treatment of the problem of desocialization must appear simply irrelevant, for why should anyone ever want to go back from an allegedly higher stage of social evolution, that is socialism, to a lower one, that is capitalism? Even within the Mises school, at best, only implicit advice on this most pressing problem confronting the people of Eastern Europe can be found. An elementary yet fundamental moral observation must precede the answer to this question. Since socialism cannot arise without the expropriation of assets originally created and owned by individual homesteaders, producers, and or contractors, all socialist property, ill-begotten from the very start, should be forfeited. No government, even if freely elected, can be considered the owner of any socialist property, for a criminal's heir, even if himself innocent, does not become the legitimate owner of illegitimately acquired assets. Because of his personal innocence, he remains exempt from prosecution, but all of his inherited gains must immediately revert to the original victims, and their repossession of socialist property must take place without their being required to pay anything. In fact, to charge a victimized population a price for the reacquisition of what was originally its own would itself be a crime and would forever take away any innocence that a government previously might have had. Empirically, this is what post-communist governments have by and large done, of course. Particularly noteworthy in this regard is the case of Germany. After the reunification of Germany in 1991, the conservative German government, backed by its Supreme Court, refused to return any of the property that had been expropriated from 1946 to 1949 under Soviet-Russian direction in former East Germany, more than 50% of all agriculturally used land, to its original owners. Instead, the government sold this land to its own favoured clients, which in many cases included the former communist expropriators turned capitalists. By contrast, to this day the original owners or their heirs have not received a penny in compensation. More specifically, all original property titles should be recognized immediately, regardless of who presently owns them. Insofar as the claims of original private owners or their heirs clash with those of the current asset's users, the former should override the latter. Only if a current user can prove that an original owner-heir's claim is illegitimate, that the title to the property in question had initially been acquired by coercive or fraudulent means, should the user's claim prevail, and should he be recognized as the legitimate owner. In those cases in which current users actually bought expropriated assets from the government, they should seek compensation from those responsible for this sale, and the government officials accountable for it should be compelled to repay the purchase price. Regarding socialist property that is not reclaimed in this way, syndicalist ideas should be implemented. That is, the ownership of assets should immediately be transferred to those who use them, the farmland to the farmers, the factories to the workers, the streets to the street workers or the residents, the schools to the teachers, the bureaus to the bureaucrats, and so on. The reference to syndicalist ideas here is not to be interpreted as an endorsement of the program of syndicalism. Quite to the contrary, the syndicalist slogan, the railways to the railwaymen, the mines to the miners, the factories to the factory hands, was originally meant to be a program of expropriation of the private owners of capitalist enterprises. Syndicalism, like socialism, writes Mises, aims at the abolition of the separation of workers from the means of production, only it proceeds by another method. Not all workers will become the owners of all the means of production. Those of the particular industry or undertaking, or the workers engaged in a complete branch of production, will obtain the means of production employed in it. End quote. The use of syndicalist ideas here is proposed to the very opposite effect, that is, as a means of privatizing previously socialized factors of production in such cases where no identifiable, original, expropriated private owner of these factors exists. Furthermore, the ethical rationale for the application of the syndicalist slogan in those, and only those cases, lies in the fact that such a privatization scheme approximates most closely the method described by John Locke of the first, original, just appropriation of previously unowned resources. The railwaymen have in fact mixed their labour with the railroads and the miners with the mines. Hence, their claim to these resources must be deemed better founded than anyone else's. To break up the mostly oversized socialist production conglomerates, the syndicalist principle should be applied to those production units in which a given individual's work is actually performed, that is, to individual office buildings, schools, streets or blocks of streets, factories and farms. Unlike syndicalism, yet of the utmost importance, the property shares thus acquired should be freely tradable and a stock market established so as to allow a separation of the functions of owner capitalists and non-owning employees and the smooth and continuous transfer of assets from less into more value-productive hands. According to the original syndicalist program, which aims to abolish permanently the separation of the worker from the means of production, any trade or sale of his property share by the worker must be precluded. If syndicalist reform is to mean more than the mere redistribution of productive goods, explains Mises, then it cannot allow the property arrangements of capitalism to persist in regard to the means of production. It must withdraw productive goods from the market. Individual citizens must not dispose of the shares in the means of production allotted to them, for under syndicalism these are bound up with the person of the owner in a much closer way than is the case in the liberal society. End quote. In effect, under syndicalism the worker is not owner in the normal sense of the word, for ownership, as Mises notes, is always where the power to dispose resides. Private property exists only where the individual can deal with his private ownership in the means of production in the way he considers most advantageous. End quote. In fact, if workers were permitted to dispose of their shares, conditions would quickly return to the capitalist status quo ante, with a clear separation of owner-capitalist, property on the one hand, and workers, labour on the other. However, if this is not permitted, explains Mises, then insurmountable difficulties arise unless it is unrealistically assumed, quote, that no changes occur in the methods of production, in the relations of supply and demand, in technique or in population. If changes in the direction and extent of demand or in the technique of production cause changes in the organization of the industry, which require the transfer of workers from one concern to another or from one branch of production to another, the question immediately arises what is to be done with the shares of these workers in the means of production. Should the workers and their heirs keep the shares in those industries to which they happen to belong at the actual time of syndicalization and enter the new industries as simple workers earning wages without being allowed to draw any part of the property income? Or should they lose their share on leaving an industry and in return receive a share per head equal to that possessed by the workers already occupied in the new industry? Either solution would quickly violate the principle of syndicalism. If the worker on his departure from an industry loses his share and on entering another industry acquires a share in that, those workers who stood to lose by the change would naturally oppose energetically every change in production. The introduction of a process making for greater productivity of labor would be resisted if it displaced workers or might displace them. On the other hand, the workers in an undertaking or branch of industry would oppose any development by the introduction of new workers if it threatened to reduce their income from property. In short, syndicalism would make every change in production practically impossible. Where it existed, there could be no question of economic progress." End quote. Two problems are connected with this privatization strategy. First, what is to be done in the case of newly erected structures, which according to the proposed scheme would be owned by their current productive users, built on land that is to revert to a different original owner? While it may appear straightforward enough to award each current producer with an equal property share, how many shares should go to the landowner? Instead of awarding equal property shares to all current producers, for justice to prevail, it would actually be preferable to award unequal shares in accordance with the time that a worker has served within a given production unit. This would also permit the inclusion of currently retired workers in the proposed privatization scheme and thus solve the so-called pension problem. Structures and land cannot be physically separated. In terms of economic theory, they are absolutely specific complementary production factors whose relative contribution to their joint value product cannot be disentangled. In this case, there is no alternative but to bargain. This, contrary to the first impression that it might lead to permanent, unresolvable conflict, should hardly cause many headaches, for invariably there are only two parties and strictly limited resources involved in any such dispute. Moreover, to find a quick mutually agreeable compromise is in both parties' interest, and if either party possesses a weaker bargaining position, it is clearly the landowner, because he cannot sell the land without the structure owner's consent, while they could dismantle the structure without needing the landowner's permission. Second, the syndicalist privatization strategy implies that producers in capital-intensive industries would have a relative advantage as compared to those in labor-intensive industries. The value of the property shares received by the former would exceed the wealth awarded to the latter, and this unequal distribution of wealth would require justification, or so it seems. In fact, such justification is readily available. Contrary to widespread liberal, that is, social democratic beliefs, there is nothing ethically wrong with inequality. Indeed, the problem of privatizing formerly socialized property is almost perfectly analogous to that of establishing private property in a state of nature, that is, when resources are previously unowned. In this situation, according to the central Lockean idea of natural rights, which coincides with most people's natural sense of justice, private property is established through acts of homesteading, by mixing one's labor with nature-given resources before anyone else has done so. In Two Treatises of Government, Book 2, Section 27, John Locke writes, quote, "Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with it, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature placed it in, it hath by this labor something annexed to it that excludes the common right of other men. For this labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough, and as good left in common for others." End quote. In order to forestall any misunderstanding, the endorsement of Locke here refers exclusively to his central homesteading idea. It does not include an endorsement of the first statement of the just quoted passage or of the infamous proviso which concludes the passage. To the contrary, the first statement regarding the common ownership of nature requires unnecessary as well as unsubstantiable theological presuppositions. Prior to an act of original appropriation, nature is and must be regarded as simply unowned. Thus the proviso is plainly inconsistent with Locke's main idea and must be abandoned. From the rejection of Locke's initial premise, it follows that criticisms of Locke's theory of original appropriation, such as Herbert Spencer's in Social Statics, must be rejected as invalid too. Spencer shares Locke's initial premise, but based on this he concludes that this prohibits any private ownership in ground land whatsoever. Land, according to Spencer, can only be leased from society by paying a ground rent for its use. Insofar as any differences between the quality of nature-given resources exist, as will surely be the case, the outcome generated by the homesteading ethic will be inequality rather than equality. The syndicalist privatization approach is merely the application of this homesteading principle to slightly changed circumstances. The socialized factors of production are already homesteaded by particular individuals. Only their property right regarding particular production factors has been ignored so far, and all that would occur under the proposed scheme is that this unjustifiable situation would finally be rectified. If such rectification results in inequalities, this is no more unfair than the inequalities that would emerge under a regime of original, unadulterated homesteading. Moreover, our syndicalist proposal is economically more efficient than the only conceivable privatization alternative in line with the basic requirement of justice, the recognition that the government does not legitimately own the socialized economy, hence selling or auctioning it off should be out of the question. According to the latter alternative, the entire population would receive equal shares in all of the country's assets not reclaimed by an original expropriated owner. Aside from the questionable moral quality of this policy, it would be extremely inefficient. How can one justify that ownership of productive assets be assigned without considering a given individual's actions or inactions in relation to the owned asset? More specifically, how can it be justified that someone who has contributed literally nothing to the existence or maintenance of a particular asset, and who might not even know that such an asset exists, own it in the same way as someone else who actively and objectifiably contributed to its existence or maintenance? For one thing, in order for such countrywide distributed shares to become tradable property titles, they must specify to which particular resource they refer. Therefore, to implement this proposal, first a complete inventory of all of the country's assets would be required, or at least an inventory of all its distinctively separable production units. Second, even if such an inventory were finally assembled, the owners would consist by and large of individuals who knew next to nothing about the assets they owned. In contrast, under the non-egalitarian syndicalist privatization scheme, no inventory is necessary. Furthermore, initial ownership comes to rest exclusively with individuals who, because of their productive involvement with the assets owned by them, are by and large best informed to make a first realistic appraisal of such assets. In conjunction with the privatization of all assets according to the principles outlined, the government should adopt a private property constitution and declare it to be the immutable basic law for the entire country. This constitution should be extremely brief and lay down the following principles in terms as unambiguous as possible. Every person, apart from being the sole owner of his physical body, has the right to employ his private property in any way he sees fit, so long as in so doing he does not uninvitedly change the physical integrity of another person's body or property. All interpersonal exchanges and all exchanges of property titles between private owners are to be voluntary, contractual. These rights of a person are absolute. Any person's infringement on them is subject to lawful prosecution by the victim of this infringement or his agent, and is actionable in accordance with the principles of the proportionality of punishment and of strict liability. As implied by this Constitution, then, all existing wage and price controls, all property regulations and licensing requirements, and all import and export restrictions should be immediately abolished, and complete freedom of contract, occupation, trade and migration introduced. Subsequently, the government, now propertyless, should declare its own continued existence unconstitutional insofar as it depends on non-contractual property acquisitions, that is, taxation, and abdicate. 3. The result of this complete abolition of socialism and the establishment of a pure private property society, an anarchy of private property owners regulated exclusively by private property law, would be the quickest way to economic recovery for Eastern Europe. From the outset, by and large, the population would be amazingly rich, for although the economies of Eastern Europe are in shambles, the countries are not destroyed. Real estate values are high, and despite all of the capital consumption of the past, there are still massive amounts of capital goods in existence. With no government sector left and the entire national wealth in private hands, the people of Eastern Europe could soon become objects of envy among their West European counterparts. Moreover, releasing factors of production from political control and handing them over to private individuals who are allowed to use them as they see fit as long as they do not physically damage the resources owned by others provides the ultimate stimulus for future production. With an unrestricted market for capital goods, rational cost accounting becomes possible. With profits as well as losses individualized and reflected in an owner's capital and sales account, every single producer's incentive to increase the quantity and or quality of his output and to avoid any over- or underutilization of his capital is maximized. In particular, the constitutional provision that only the physical integrity of property, not property values, be protected guarantees that every owner will undertake the greatest value-productive efforts to promote favorable changes in property values, and to prevent and counter any unfavorable ones, as might result from another person's actions regarding his property. Specifically, the abolishment of all price controls eliminate almost instantaneously all present shortages, and output would begin to increase immediately, both quantitatively as well as qualitatively. Unemployment would drastically increase temporarily, yet with flexible wage rates, without collective bargaining, and without unemployment subsidies, it would quickly disappear. Initially, average wage rates would remain substantially below Western rates, but this too would soon change. Lured by comparatively low wages, but the fact that East Europeans will expectedly show a great need for cashing in, liquidating their newly acquired capital assets so as to finance their current consumption, and above all by the fact that East Europe would be a no-tax, free-trade haven, large numbers of investors and huge amount of capital would begin to flow in immediately. The production of security, of police protection, and of a judicial system, which is usually assumed to lie outside the province of free markets and be the proper function of government, would most likely be taken over by major Western insurance companies. Providing insurance for personal property, police action, the prevention and detection of crime, as well as the exaction of compensation, is in fact part of this industry's natural business. If it were not for governments preventing insurers from doing so and arrogating this task to itself, with all the usual and familiar inefficiencies resulting from such a monopolization. Likewise, being already in the business of arbitrating conflicts between claimants of competing insurers, insurance companies would naturally assume the function of a judicial system. Yet more important than the entrance of big business, such as insurance companies, into the field of security production, would be the influx of large numbers of small entrepreneurs, in particular from Western Europe. Facing a heavy tax burden in the welfare states of Western Europe, as well as being stifled there by countless regulations, licensing requirements, labor protection laws, mandated working and shop opening hours, an unregulated private property economy in Eastern Europe would be an almost irresistible attraction. Soon the large-scale influx of entrepreneurial talent and capital would begin to raise real wage rates, stimulate internal savings, and lead to a rapidly accelerating process of capital accumulation. Rather than leaving the East, migration would quickly take place in the opposite direction, with increasing numbers of Western Europeans abandoning welfare socialism for the unlimited opportunities offered in the East. Finally, faced with increasing losses of productive individuals, which would put even more pressure on their welfare budgets, the power elites of Western Europe would be forced to begin desocializing Western Europe as well. It hardly needs to be mentioned that the actual course of desocialization in Eastern Europe since 1989 has proceeded along rather different lines from those proposed here, nor should this come as a surprise. Notwithstanding the dramatic convulsions that have occurred since 1989, the size of Eastern European governments in terms of personnel and resource ownership is still overwhelming, even by the already high Western standards. Furthermore, government personnel at local, provincial and federal levels still consists largely of the same individuals as before 1989, and many of the post-communist political leaders of Eastern Europe were already prominent and had risen to eminent positions under communist rule. To most of them, classical liberal and libertarian ideas were simply unheard of, but they were all too familiar with welfare statist notions. Moreover, if the liberal libertarian prescriptions of instant and complete privatization of all collective property outlined above had been put into effect, all government jobs would have disappeared immediately. Government employees would have been left to the vagaries of the market and forced to find new productive occupations. Alternatively, if the familiar Western European welfare state model were accepted as exemplary, and if the Eastern bureaucracies took charge of the irreversible trend towards desocialization and thereby controlled and regulated the privatization of non-vital parts of their massive resource holdings, down to but not below Western levels, most bureaucratic jobs could not only be secured, but government revenue and the salaries of bureaucrats could actually increase. In addition, because of Western governments' interests in an orderly transition from socialism to welfare statism, Eastern bureaucracies and leaders adopting such a reform course could expect that at least part of the risks associated with it would be assumed or financed by the Western counterparts. Furthermore, during the communist era, cooperation between East and West was extremely limited. As a result of the inefficiencies of socialist production, Eastern Europe was incapable of selling anything to the West except raw materials and basic consumer goods, and Western transactions with the East Bloc typically accounted for less than 5% of foreign trade. Foreign ownership in Eastern Europe was essentially outlawed. Not a single Eastern currency was freely convertible to Western currencies, and even political contacts were comparatively rare. However, with the collapse of communism, the Eastern European governments had something to offer. To be sure, West-East trade is still low, and in the immediate wake of the revolutionary upheavals across Eastern Europe, it has even fallen. But without the dogma that social means the collective ownership of factors of production, some of the nationalized wealth of Eastern Europe has suddenly come up for grabs. And with the Eastern government in control of the denationalization process, Western political leaders and government-connected bankers and big businessmen have immediately increased the contacts with their Eastern counterparts. In exchange for Western aid during the transition phase, Eastern governments now had real assets to sell. In addition, the East could assure eager Western buyers that from the outset, the tax and regulation structure of the newly emerging economies of Eastern Europe would be harmonized with European community standards. Most importantly, Eastern governments could sell the assurance that Eastern Europe's new banking system would be set up along familiar Western lines, with a governmentally controlled central bank, a fractional reserve banking cartel of privately owned commercial banks, and a convertible fiat money backed by reserves of Western fiat currencies, thereby allowing the Western banking system to initiate an internationally coordinated credit expansion and thus to establish monetary and financial hegemony over the newly emerging Eastern European economies. Thus today, a decade after the collapse of socialism, the countries of Eastern Europe are well on the way toward Western welfare statism, social democracy. Because of the partial privatization and the elimination of most, although by no means all, price controls, Eastern Europe's economic performance has certainly improved beyond its former desperate showing. This improvement has in turn brought its Western payoff in the form of increased economic integration, a widening of markets, an extensification and intensification of the division of labor, and an expanding volume of mutually beneficial international trade. However, due to the limited extent of privatization and a gradualist reform strategy, the Eastern recovery process has been painfully slow, causing seemingly permanent mass unemployment and rapid monetary inflation and currency crises. Moreover, because the average size of government in the countries of Eastern Europe is still significantly larger than in the semi-socialist countries of Western Europe, economic progress in Eastern Europe and the stimulus thereby given to the Western economies will only be temporary, and economic recovery and expansionism will likely soon be replaced by stagnation in the West and, on a permanently lower level, East alike. 4. Postscript on privatization in welfare states. While it should be clear from the foregoing considerations why, from a moral as well as an economic point of view, the Western welfare states require as thorough a reform as the former socialist countries of Eastern Europe, it is important to note that the method of privatization must be different in both cases. The syndicalist privatization strategy proposed for formerly socialist countries applied, as will be recalled, only in such cases where no identifiable previously expropriated private owner or heir of socialized factors of production existed. If such an owner-heir could be identified, then he should be again installed as private owner. If and only if no such owner-heir existed, could it be considered just to install the current and or past users of socialized production factors as their private owners? Because they, and only they, have then an objectifiable, that is, intersubjectively ascertainable tie to these resources. Only they, of all people, have de facto homesteaded the factors of production in question. Thus, only their ownership claim can be said to have any real, objective foundation. By the same token, it would be without any real foundation whatsoever, and thus utterly indefensible from a moral point of view, if private ownership in the publicly owned production factors of the mixed welfare state economies of the Western world were assigned to public sector employees, that is, the so-called civil servants, along the line of the syndicalist slogan, the public schools to the teachers, the universities to the professors, the post offices to the postal workers, the public land to the bureaucrats of the Bureau of Land Management, the courthouses and police stations to the judges and policemen, etc. Indeed, to do so would constitute nothing less than a moral outrage, even in the rather typical case where the public property in question is not the result of a prior expropriation of some formerly private owner of this property by means of the government's power of eminent domain, in which case the property should be simply returned to the original owner-heir. Even in this case, all public property is still the result of some form of expropriation, and although the proper identification of the victims of this expropriation is more difficult than in the clear-cut case of eminent domain, it is by no means impossible. In any case, it is obvious that civil servants are typically not among the victims. Hence, they of all people have the least well-founded claim to private ownership of this property. Publicly owned buildings and structures were all financed by taxes, and as far as undeveloped public land is concerned, it is the result of a public that is tax-funded and enforced policy prohibiting the private appropriation and development of nature and natural resources. Hence it would appear that it is taxpayers, in accordance with their amount of taxes paid, who should be given title to public buildings and structures, while undeveloped public land simply should be opened up to private homesteading. Keep in mind that civil servants are not taxpayers, even though in public discourse they frequently fancy themselves to be so. Rather, their net income is typically paid out of taxes paid by other individuals working in the private sector of the economy. Civil servants are tax consumers, just as public welfare recipients are tax consumers rather than taxpayers. Hence, civil servants as well as welfare recipients should be excluded from private ownership in formerly public buildings and structures. Both civil servants and welfare recipients live off other people's tax payments, and it would add insult to injury if they, instead of those who had paid their salaries and handouts as well as the public buildings and structures that they occupy and control, should be awarded ownership of these buildings and structures. To be sure, a number of complications would arise in this privatization scheme. In order to determine the ownership shares granted to various individuals in buildings and structures currently owned by a local, state, and federal government, these individuals would have to provide documentation of their past payments of local, state, and federal taxes respectively, and in each case past welfare payments received must be deducted from taxes paid in order to arrive at a figure for the amount of net taxes paid. In a fully privatized market society, the task of finding a detailed solution to this problem would be typically assumed by private accountants, lawyers, and arbitration agencies, financed directly or indirectly against a contingency fee by the individual claimants. As regards undeveloped public land available for private homesteading activities, every public land manager, ranger, etc. should be excluded for a similar reason from homesteading land currently occupied and formerly guarded by him against potential private developers. He may be permitted to homestead other public land that is presently occupied and formerly guarded against private development by other government agents. But to allow him to homestead land he currently occupies would give him an advantage over other potential homesteaders that would be manifestly unfair in light of the fact that it was he, paid in this by taxpayers, who had previously kept these taxpayers off and away from this land.